He kicked out his pregnant wife to marry his first love, unaware she was a secret trillionaire heiress. The woman carrying his child stood in the rain outside their penthouse while he laughed with another woman inside. But what he didn't know was that the trembling figure clutching her swollen belly controlled more wealth than his entire company's market valuation. He left her to rot unaware of her global banking empire. 5 years of marriage dissolved in a single afternoon as he threw her belongings onto the marble driveway. But beneath her plain dresses and quiet demeanor existed a financial titan who owned the very banks that financed his business loans. When she returned with his boss, 18 months later, he knelt and begged. The reunion happened in his corner office, where he'd once felt powerful. But the woman he'd discarded now stood beside the man he reported to, wearing a $1,000 suit and an expression colder than winter. How had the wife he'd treated like a burden transformed into the elegant powerhouse, commanding his superiors' respect? What global banking empire had she been hiding behind her role as devoted housewife? Why had she concealed her trillionaire status throughout their entire marriage? And would the man who'd chosen his first love over his pregnant wife ever understand the magnitude of what he'd destroyed? Raymond Foster stood in the living room of the penthouse he'd purchased 3 years ago, but the pride he'd once felt about this achievement had evaporated the moment Vanessa walked back into his life. His wife, no, his soon-to-be ex-wife, Claire, sat on the leather sofa with her hand protectively over her 6-month pregnant belly, but Raymond couldn't bring himself to care about the child she carried anymore. "I want a divorce," he said, his voice steady despite the trembling in Claire's shoulders. "I've already had the papers drawn up." Claire looked up at him with those soft, gray eyes that had once made him feel like he was the only man in the world. But now those same eyes just irritated him with their silent pleading. "Raymond, please, we can work through this. The baby doesn't change anything," Raymond interrupted, running his hand through his perfectly styled dark hair. "I married you because I thought you were what I needed, stable, dependable. But I was wrong." He'd met Claire Foster, born Claire Whitmore, 5 years ago at a charity fundraiser where she'd been serving hors d'oeuvres. But what had attracted him then was her quiet grace and the way she never demanded anything from him. She'd been working as an event coordinator, living in a modest apartment, driving a 15-year-old sedan, but she'd treated him with a genuine kindness that his social circle lacked. They'd married within 8 months, but the entire relationship had been built on Raymond's assumption that he was rescuing her from a life of mediocrity. "Vanessa is back," Raymond continued, watching Claire's face crumble at the mention of his first love. "She's divorced now, free, and I realize I never stopped loving her." Vanessa Hart had been Raymond's college sweetheart, the daughter of a prominent real estate developer, sophisticated, glamorous, everything Raymond had thought he wanted, but she'd married someone wealthier during their senior year. For 12 years, Raymond had buried his feelings, but when Vanessa had shown up at his office 3 months ago, newly divorced and looking for investment opportunities, every suppressed emotion had come roaring back. Claire stood slowly, her hand never leaving her belly, but Raymond noticed she wasn't crying yet. "What about our vows? What about the life we built?" "The life we built," Raymond laughed bitterly. "Claire, be honest with yourself. You brought nothing to this marriage except companionship. I gave you this life. This penthouse, the cars, the security. Everything you have came from me." The words hung in the air like poison, but Raymond believed every syllable. Claire had never worked after they'd married, at his insistence, but he'd rewritten that history in his mind. She had no family money, no inheritance, no prospects, but Raymond had elevated her from her working-class existence into his upper-middle-class world. He was Foster Dynamics' chief operations officer, earning 7 figures annually, but his ambition reached far higher. "I want you out by tomorrow," Raymond said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "These are the divorce papers. I'm being generous. You'll get $50,000 and 6 months to find somewhere to live. Sign them." Claire took the envelope with shaking hands, but her voice was surprisingly steady when she spoke. "And our child?" "We'll arrange custody and child support once it's born," Raymond said dismissively. "But I'm going to be honest, Claire. This baby was a mistake. You knew I wanted to wait until my career was more established, but you went behind my back and stopped taking your birth control." That was a lie, but Raymond had convinced himself it was truth over the past 3 months. The pregnancy had been accidental, a broken condom neither of them had noticed, but Raymond needed to justify his actions somehow. Claire's gray eyes hardened for just a moment, but then the expression vanished so quickly. Raymond thought he had imagined it. "I never stopped taking my birth control, Raymond, but I can see nothing I say will matter now." "Sign the papers," Raymond repeated. "Vanessa is coming for dinner tonight. I want you gone before she arrives." That's when Claire did something Raymond never expected. She laughed, but it was a soft, sad sound that made him uncomfortable. "Vanessa is coming for dinner in our home while I'm still your wife." "You won't be my wife for long," Raymond said coldly. "Now pack your things." He'd expected tears, screaming, desperate pleas, but Claire simply nodded and walked toward their bedroom. For 5 years, she'd been the perfect wife, cooking his favorite meals, managing their household, supporting his career, asking for nothing in return. But Raymond had interpreted her selflessness as a lack of ambition or capability. What Raymond didn't know, what he couldn't have known because Claire had hidden it so carefully, was that the woman packing her belongings in their bedroom owned controlling shares in 7 of the 10 largest international banks. But she'd concealed this empire behind layers of shell corporations and trusts. Claire Whitmore wasn't from a working-class background, but from one of the oldest banking families in America. The Whitmores had built their fortune over 5 generations, but after her parents' death in a plane crash, when she was 22, Claire had inherited everything, $30 billion in assets. But the public nature of her family's wealth had made her previous life unbearable, surrounded by fortune hunters, fake friends, people who wanted her money rather than her heart. So she'd disappeared, but deliberately. She'd created a new identity, simple and unassuming, working ordinary jobs, living an ordinary life, but keeping her empire running through trusted advisors and a private management team. When she'd met Raymond at that fundraiser, she'd been testing whether someone could love her for herself, but clearly she'd chosen wrong. Now, as she packed her clothes into a suitcase, Claire allowed herself a moment of grief for the marriage she'd believed was real, but she wouldn't cry where Raymond could see. She'd given him everything she was, her love, her loyalty, her complete devotion, but he'd valued none of it because he hadn't known its monetary worth. The irony was devastating, but Claire understood it perfectly. Raymond had married her thinking he was her benefactor, but the penthouse he was so proud of. Claire's real estate holdings included the entire building, the luxury car he drove, financed through a bank Claire owned, his position at Foster Dynamics. The company's operating loans came from Whitmore Financial Group, but under such complex arrangements that no one connected the dots. She'd watched over Raymond's career from the shadows, but never interfering, never controlling, just ensuring he succeeded based on his own merits. She'd loved him enough to let him feel like the provider, but he'd repaid that love by kicking out his pregnant wife. When Claire emerged from the bedroom 40 minutes later with 2 suitcases, Raymond was on the phone laughing about something, but he quickly ended the call when he saw her. "That was fast," he said. surprised she wasn't putting up more of a fight. "I'm staying at a hotel tonight," Claire said quietly. "I'll have the rest of my things picked up this week." "And the papers?" Claire set down her suitcases and opened the envelope, but she didn't read the contents. She already knew what they'd say because she'd dealt with enough legal documents to recognize predatory terms. $50,000 for 5 years of marriage. No mention of property division because Raymond believed there was no shared property to divide, but legally she was entitled to half of everything he'd accumulated during their marriage. She signed her name with the pen Raymond handed her, but she noted he'd already signed his portion. "There, you're free." Raymond took the papers, visibly relieved, but he couldn't quite meet her eyes. "This is better for both of us, Claire. You'll see that eventually." "Perhaps I will," Claire agreed, but there was something in her tone that made Raymond look at her sharply. She looked different somehow, standing straighter, her gray eyes clearer, but Raymond dismissed the observation. This was just Claire being dramatic, but by tomorrow she'd be out of his life, and he could begin his new chapter with Vanessa. "I'll have my lawyers send you the information about child support arrangements," Raymond said, already thinking about what wine to serve with dinner. "That won't be necessary," Claire said, picking up her suitcases. "I'll manage on my own." "Claire, be reasonable." "I'm being perfectly reasonable, Raymond. You've made your choice. Now I'm making mine." She walked toward the door, but Raymond called out one last time. "You know, you should be thanking me. I gave you 5 years in a world you never could have accessed on your own." Claire paused at the threshold, but she didn't turn around. "You're right. I should be thanking you. You've taught me an invaluable lesson about trust." Then she was gone, but Raymond felt a strange unease watching her leave. He shook it off quickly. Claire would be fine, but she'd probably end up back in some working-class job, raising their child in a modest apartment, regretting that she'd lost access to his world. He had no idea that Claire was about to return to a world that would make his accomplishments look like a child playing with toy money. Part 2. The return to power. Claire checked into the Peninsula Hotel, using a credit card linked to one of her personal accounts, but this wasn't the modest accommodation Raymond would have imagined. The presidential suite cost $15,000 per night, but Claire barely noticed the expense as she settled into the familiar luxury she'd abandoned for 5 years. Her phone, not the basic smartphone Raymond knew about, but the encrypted device she'd kept hidden, rang within minutes of her arrival. "Ms. Whitmore." The voice on the other end belonged to Heiress and Chen, her chief advisor and the man who'd been managing her empire during her ordinary life experiment. "We've been monitoring the situation. Are you ready to resume your position?" Claire looked at her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows, but the woman staring back wasn't the meek housewife anymore. "Yes, schedule an emergency board meeting for tomorrow. It's time to remind the world who Claire Whitmore is." What followed was an 18-month transformation that would have seemed impossible if Claire hadn't been controlling vast resources the entire time, but she'd simply been inactive, not powerless. She resumed her position as chairman of Whitmore Financial Group, but publicly this time, making her return to the business world front-page news in every major financial publication. The media had a field day, but the narrative was irresistible. Banking heiress emerges from 5-year disappearance, and Whitmore returns. Global markets react. Claire gave carefully controlled interviews, but she never mentioned her marriage or pregnancy. That was private pain, not public spectacle. She gave birth to a daughter 7 weeks after leaving Raymond, but she named her Victoria Claire Whitmore, deliberately excluding Raymond's surname. The birth was private, attended only by medical staff she'd vetted personally, but she'd hired the best nannies and support team money could buy. During those 18 months, Claire rebuilt her public profile while simultaneously investigating Foster dynamics. But what she discovered was illuminating. The company was struggling, not obviously, but the financial foundations were weaker than they appeared. More importantly, she learned that Foster Dynamics was in merger talks with Prometheus Holdings, but the deal would require significant financial backing from Whitmore Financial Group. Claire smiled when she read that report, but it was the cold smile of someone planning their next move carefully. Michael Thornton was the CEO of Prometheus Holdings, a man Claire had known professionally for years, but their relationship had always been cordial and respectful. When she called him to discuss the Foster Dynamics merger, but added a personal request, Michael had been intrigued. "You want to tour Foster Dynamics personally?" Michael asked during their phone conversation. "That's unusual for you, Claire. You typically delegate such operational reviews." "This is a special case," Claire replied smoothly. "I have personal reasons for wanting to see their operations firsthand." Michael, who knew nothing about Claire's marriage to Raymond Foster, but sensed there was a story behind the request, agreed immediately. "Then I'll arrange for us to visit together. If we're going to partner on this merger, transparency is essential." The date was set for 18 months, to the day after Raymond had kicked out his pregnant wife. But Claire had planned every detail of this confrontation meticulously. Part 3. The confrontation. Raymond Foster sat in his corner office, but the view of the city that usually made him feel powerful now only reminded him of mounting stress. The past 18 months had been far more difficult than he'd anticipated, but he was too proud to admit his mistakes. His marriage to Vanessa had lasted exactly 4 months before she'd filed for divorce, but the split had been vicious and expensive. Vanessa, it turned out, had only been interested in Raymond's money and connections, but when his career advancement stalled, she'd left him faster than he'd left Claire. The divorce had cost him nearly everything he'd saved, but worse was the professional fallout. Without Claire managing their household, Raymond had discovered how much she'd actually handled, but he'd been too proud to admit it. His dry cleaning was never ready. His favorite meals never appeared. His social calendar was chaos, but these small inconveniences had compounded into larger professional problems. He'd missed important meetings, shown up to events underdressed, alienated key contacts, but he blamed everyone except himself. Foster Dynamics was struggling now, but Raymond didn't realize how much of the company's stability had rested on financial arrangements Claire had quietly maintained. When those supports had been withdrawn, not obviously, but through the natural expiration of favorable terms and conditions, the company had begun to falter. The merger with Prometheus Holdings was their last hope, but Raymond was terrified the deal would fall through. His assistant knocked on his door, but her expression was strangely nervous. "Mr. Foster, Mr. Thornton from Prometheus Holdings is here for the operational review, and he's brought someone with him." "Send them in," Raymond said, standing and straightening his tie, but he noticed his hands were shaking slightly. Michael Thornton entered first, tall, distinguished, the kind of man who commanded respect effortlessly, but Raymond barely registered him. His attention was completely captured by the woman walking beside Michael, but his brain couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. Claire, but not Claire as he remembered her, but transformed into someone completely unrecognizable. She wore a charcoal gray power suit that probably cost more than his monthly salary, but it was perfectly tailored to her post-pregnancy figure. Her hair, which she'd always worn long and simply, was now cut in a sleek bob that framed her face elegantly. Diamond studs, and Raymond knew enough about jewelry to recognize they were several carats each, glinted in her ears. But most shocking was her expression, but it held none of the softness he remembered. This woman looked at him like he was a balance sheet. She was auditing, but finding the numbers disappointing. "Mr. Foster, Michael said, extending his hand. I'm Michael Thornton, CEO of Prometheus Holdings, and this is Clare Whitmore, chairman of Whitmore Financial Group. She'll be overseeing the financial arrangements for our potential merger. Raymond's hand moved automatically to shake Michael's, but his eyes never left Clare. Clare? Whitmore? Yes, Clare said coolly, but she didn't offer to shake his hand. Whitmore Financial Group holds the debt instruments for several of Foster Dynamics' key operations. I'd like to personally review companies before we commit to additional financial support. Raymond's mind was reeling, but nothing made sense. Clare Whitmore, Whitmore Financial Group? That was one of the largest banking conglomerates in the world, but Clare had been a nobody. A working-class event coordinator who'd brought nothing to their marriage except companionship, but clearly he'd been catastrophically wrong. I don't understand, Raymond stammered, but he was aware of how weak he sounded. What's to understand, Mr. Foster? Clare asked, but her tone was professionally neutral. Shall we begin the operational review? I'm particularly interested in examining your financial management strategies. Michael was watching the exchange with growing interest, but he clearly sensed undercurrents he didn't fully understand. Raymond, is everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. Ms. Whitmore and I, Raymond started, but he couldn't finish the sentence. We have a prior acquaintance, Clare finished smoothly, but that shouldn't interfere with this professional evaluation, unless Mr. Foster feels there's a conflict of interest. The threat was subtle, but Raymond heard it clearly. If he admitted their relationship, he'd have to explain why he hadn't known his own wife was a banking heiress, but that would make him look incompetent. If he stayed silent, he'd have to endure this operational review while his mind was exploding with questions. No conflict, Raymond managed to say, but his voice cracked slightly. What followed was 3 hours of the most professionally brutal evaluation Raymond had ever experienced. But Clare asked questions that exposed every weakness in Foster Dynamics' financial structure. She toured the facilities, interviewed key personnel, reviewed documents, but all while maintaining perfect professional courtesy. Michael was impressed, but he made several comments about Clare's thoroughness and insight. Raymond could only watch as the woman he'd kicked out of their home demonstrated expertise that made his own accomplishments look pedestrian, but he still couldn't process the magnitude of his mistake. During a brief moment when Michael was examining some equipment with the operations manager, Raymond found himself alone with Clare in a conference room, but he knew this might be his only chance to speak with her privately. Clare, what is this? He hissed, keeping his voice low. Whitmore Financial Group? You're a banking heiress? Why didn't you tell me? Clare looked at him with those gray eyes, but they were ice now rather than soft warmth. Why would I have told you, Raymond? You made it very clear what you valued in our relationship. My money wouldn't have changed that. It only would have changed how you used me. That's not fair. Fair? Clare's laugh was sharp, but quiet. You kicked out your pregnant wife to marry your first love, but you have the audacity to talk to me about fair? You threw my belongings onto the driveway and told me I should be grateful for the 5 years you'd given me. I didn't know. Exactly, Clare interrupted, but her voice was cold steel. You didn't know. You never asked about my background, my family, my life before you. You assumed I was nobody, but you treated me accordingly. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. Raymond felt something crumbling inside him, but it was his entire self-conception. The baby, Victoria, Clare corrected. Her name is Victoria, but she's 18 months old now, healthy, happy, and she'll never know a father who valued her so little he kicked her pregnant mother out of their home. I want to meet her, Raymond said desperately, but he was grasping at anything. That will be determined by lawyers and courts, Clare replied, but her tone indicated this wasn't a negotiation. Right now, we're here on business. Foster Dynamics needs financial support for this merger, but Whitmore Financial Group will be conducting an extensive risk assessment before we commit any resources. The implications crashed over Raymond like a wave, but he finally understood his position. The merger he needed to save his career, his company, his future, but it was all in the hands of the woman he'd discarded. "You're going to destroy me," Raymond whispered. But it was a statement rather than a question. Claire tilted her head, but her expression was unreadable. "I'm going to make a business decision based on financial merit, Mr. Foster. Nothing more, nothing less. Whether Foster Dynamics survives or collapses will depend entirely on whether you've built something of actual value, but I suspect we both know the answer to that question." Before Raymond could respond, Michael returned with the operations manager, but the tour continued. Raymond mechanically answered questions and provided information, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment of his marriage to Clare, but seeing it all through a completely different lens. He'd been so proud of providing for her, but she'd owned the building they lived in. He'd felt superior about his 7-figure salary, but she controlled more wealth than he could earn in 1,000 lifetimes. He'd thought she was lucky to have him, but she'd been slumming, testing whether someone could love her without knowing her net worth. And he'd failed that test spectacularly. When the operational review finally concluded, Michael shook Raymond's hand warmly, but his words were professionally non-committal. "We'll be in touch after we complete our analysis. Thank you for your cooperation today." Claire didn't shake Raymond's hand, but she nodded politely. "Good day, Mr. Foster." They were walking toward the elevator when Raymond did something he'd never imagined he'd do, but desperation had stripped away his pride. He ran after them, but his expensive shoes slapped against the polished floor loudly. "Claire, wait, please." They turned, but Claire's expression was mildly annoyed, while Michael looked confused. Several other employees had stopped to watch, but Raymond couldn't bring himself to care about the audience. "I was wrong," Raymond said, but his voice was breaking. "About everything. I was so wrong, but I didn't understand what I had. Please, give me another chance, to be a father, to make this right, please." He knelt and begged, but right there in the hallway of Foster Dynamics, in front of his colleagues and subordinates. He knelt and begged the woman he'd once thrown out like garbage, but now he understood what he'd actually lost. Claire looked down at him, but her expression didn't soften. "Stand up, Raymond, you're embarrassing yourself." "I don't care," Raymond said, but tears were streaming down his face now. "I love you. I never stopped loving you, but I was too stupid to realize it until now. Vanessa meant nothing. She left me the moment things got difficult, but I threw away everything real for something fake." "You didn't love me," Claire said quietly, but her voice carried through the silent hallway. "You loved having someone to take care of you. There's a difference, but you never learned it." "I'll do anything," Raymond pleaded, but he was fully sobbing now. "Anything to have you back, to be a father to Victoria, to prove I've changed." Michael touched Claire's arm gently, but his expression was uncomfortable with the public spectacle. "Claire, perhaps we should—" "No," Claire said, but she was still looking at Raymond. "He needs to hear this." She crouched down so she was eye level with Raymond, but her movement was graceful despite the intimacy of the position. "You kicked out your pregnant wife because you thought you could do better. You left her to rot, but you actually believed she'd be desperate and grateful for whatever scraps you offered. When she returned with your boss, but transformed into someone you couldn't ignore or dismiss, only then did you kneel and beg." "I'm sorry." "You're not sorry for what you did," Claire interrupted gently but firmly. "You're sorry you miscalculated. You're sorry you threw away a strategic asset. You're sorry your cruelty came back to haunt you, but you're not sorry for the actual harm you caused." She stood, but smoothed her suit jacket. "Victoria will know her father if and when I decide she's ready for that relationship. But it will be on my terms, not yours. Foster Dynamics will receive or be denied financial support based purely on business merits, but I won't let personal feelings interfere with professional decisions, unlike you." "And us?" Raymond asked desperately, but he was still kneeling. "There is no us," Claire said, but without anger, just finality. "There never really was. You married a fantasy, but you never knew the real me, and I married someone I hoped could love me for who I was. But you only loved what you thought I represented." She turned to Michael, but her professional demeanor snapped back instantly. "Shall we go? We have another meeting this afternoon." "Of course," Michael agreed, but he gave Raymond one last uncomfortable glance. They walked to the elevator, but Raymond remained kneeling on the floor, broken and humiliated. His colleagues stared at him with a mixture of pity and disgust, but the man who'd once felt so powerful in this building now understood he'd never had any real power at all. The elevator doors closed on Claire and Michael, but inside the car, Michael finally voiced his confusion. "That was your ex-husband?" he asked carefully. "Yes," Claire confirmed, but she was checking her phone. "He didn't know who you were?" "No, but that was intentional on my part. I wanted to see if someone could love me without knowing my net worth, but I chose poorly." Michael was quiet for a moment, but then he spoke carefully. "For what it's worth, I think you made the right decision, both then and now." "Thank you," Claire said, but she finally looked up from her phone. "And the merger?" "Foster Dynamics has potential, but it's being held back by poor leadership. If we proceed, I'll be recommending Raymond Foster's position be eliminated, but that's purely a business decision." "Of course," Claire agreed, but there was the faintest hint of satisfaction in her voice. 3 months later, the merger was completed, but Raymond Foster was no longer with Foster Dynamics. He'd been offered a generous severance package, arranged by Claire personally, but made to look like a standard corporate decision. She'd ensured he wouldn't be destitute, but she'd also ensured he'd never again hold the kind of position where he could look down on others. Victoria was 2 years old now, but she was being raised in a world of privilege that came with heavy responsibilities. Claire had begun teaching her daughter about charity, kindness, and the proper use of wealth, but she was determined Victoria would never be cruel or dismissive of those with less. Raymond had visitation rights now, but supervised and limited. He saw his daughter twice a month, but each visit reminded him of everything he'd lost. Victoria was brilliant, beautiful, and already showed signs of her mother's quiet strength, but she barely knew him. One evening, after a particularly difficult visitation session, Raymond sat in his modest apartment, so different from the penthouse he'd once owned, but he finally allowed himself to fully process his mistakes. He'd kicked out his pregnant wife to marry his first love, unaware she was a secret Trillionaire heiress. But his ignorance didn't excuse his cruelty. He'd left her to rot unaware of her global banking empire. But even if she'd been exactly what he thought she was, a working-class nobody with no prospects, his treatment of her would still have been unforgivable. When she returned with his boss, he knelt and begged, but it was too late. Some mistakes can't be unmade, but some consequences can't be avoided. Raymond had learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible, but he'd learned it too late to save anything that mattered. Claire, meanwhile, had moved forward with her life, but she'd emerged stronger from the experience. She'd proven to herself that she could survive betrayal, but rebuild from it. She'd learned that hiding her true self hadn't protected her from pain, but it had prevented her from finding genuine love. Someday, perhaps, she'd try again. But next time she wouldn't hide who she was. Next time she'd demand someone love all of her, the banking heiress and the woman who just wanted to be valued for herself, but without artificial distinctions between the two. As for Raymond Foster, he'd spend the rest of his life as a cautionary tale, but whispered in business circles and social gatherings, the man who'd kicked out his pregnant wife to marry his first love, unaware she was a secret trillionaire heiress, the man who'd left her to rot, unaware of her global banking empire, the man who'd knelt and begged when she returned with his boss, but found no mercy in the woman he'd once discarded. Some stories have happy endings, but this wasn't one of them, at least not for Raymond. For Claire and Victoria, however, but the story was just beginning and it promised to be extraordinary.